Hello and welcome to this webinar by OpsMill on getting to know Infrahub 1.0. And my name is Alex Anthoniwani. I'm here as a marketer with OpsMill, and our featured speaker today is Brett. Oh gosh, I just realized I didn't know Likens.
So lichens, yep, yep.
Brett Likens. Like I've never said your last name before. No, I
It's
have.
funny, yeah, when it's small, there's not more than one Brett, so what are you why you need it? Yeah.
Yeah, so Brett Likens with us. We also as just here as resources, particularly to answer questions or just to monitor for things. We have the true Pete Crocker, um, as well as the non Pete Crocker, just which is Jordan Villarreal. Um, so, but who's masquerading as Pete Crocker. So, anyway, most of you have been on a Zoom webinar, but just in case you had, and the way to interact really is through the Q&A panel, and the Q&A panel is open for comments and questions. So we'd love to make this as interactive as possible. If you do interject or put questions in, I think the best way is for us, and I know we will be monitoring, is to try to handle those in the flow as much as possible and not put everything off to the end. Obviously, if there's some things that we wait, for at the end, we'll try to get those. But I think as much as possible, we'll try to keep this as interactive with your questions and comments. So feel free to say hi, to say make a comment, or whatever it is. If it's just a question, anything that's not clear, you would like to get a little bit more clarity on, we really welcome that so that we can make this as useful for you as possible. All right. So with that, I am going to put myself on mute. I'm going to hand this over to Brett and let him take it from here.
Alright, thank you, Alex. Yeah, so my name's Brett Likens. If you're here to get to know Infrahub 1.0, you are in the right place. And so, here at OpsMill, I run our product group. I've been doing network engineering for going on 20 years now, which surprised me when I stopped to think about it the other day. But uh, been focused on network automation specifically for the last 10. I was doing before then, but wholly on network automation for about the last 10 years. And one thing about OpsMill you'll see, so our mascot is an otter named Otto. And one of the things you get when you start at OpsMill is you actually get your otter avatar. And so we don't need this old headshot. There's the otter me now from here on. So sprinkle throughout, you'll see some more of our good otter friends here. But yeah, as Alex said, always please speak up, ask questions in the Q&A panel. Pete is going to be keeping an eye on that and be able to either answer in there or interject in out loud here if we need to. So we're going to go through a few different things. Going to just like we're doing the introduction now. We're going to cover a little bit about Infrahub if you've not had any exposure to it. Just kind of a refresh, level set, so everybody's on the same page. And then dive into some of the things that we've done here in our main GA release in Infrahub 1.0. Just focused a lot on things that are getting it the features in there that we need for our enterprise customers, and kind of driving towards a future where Infrahub is able to be a very critical component of your infrastructure automation solution. So when we talk about Infrahub, what is Infrahub? So really Infrahub sits at a point to be a platform servicing all of your infrastructure, not just network devices, but includes security, the cloud, all kinds of things. And the idea is to help you manage the data that is necessary to automate the broad scope of things that are in your infrastructure. So Infrahub sits as a central hub to sort of power that through. It focuses on managing your data and allowing you the tools and things you need to control and manipulate that data so you can perform automated actions on your equipment. So if we talk about what does that mean in practice? What is Infrahub built out of? What does it do? So the first thing is that it's built around a unified storage engine, which essentially means the idea that in the past, if you were building these tools yourself, or if you were using an off the shelf tool, some kind of different project, you kind of had to pick of, is the data in a database, or do I have files sitting somewhere with configuration in them? What does that look like? The idea with Infrahub is we bring that together in one system and wrap some version control around that so you can really keep track of not just the data, but things that are created from the data, version all of those things, and maintain them in the way you would want to. So not just the data itself, but also then the idea is to be able to, in the system, generate configuration itself. So you have artifacts that you can render, network device configuration, Terraform files, whatever you need to do with the data about your infrastructure, you can do with Infrahub and generate the things you need. You can also take just it's not just about I have to put all of my data into the system, also has the ability to dynamically generate portions of the database itself. So say I have a site and I know a site needs these 5 devices because it's a site of this specific type. I can have a generator that also creates the 5 relevant devices in the database. And so you have that ability to be focused at a service level, at a design level, not just at the sort of bits and bobs of I have this device, it has these configurations, you're able to step above that. Um, Also key component in there, it's built around a CI pipeline to perform checks on that data. So again, built into the tool, not a separate system, built into Infrahub itself, you're able to perform checks of should that change, should you be able to change that value to a different value? You want to say maybe control the an ACL or something like that, whatever it may be, where you want to set some policy around it, you can do that beyond even just basic data sanitization of is that a string or should it be an integer, those kind of things as well. But you have a CI pipeline to allow you to check all of part of that as well as a peer review process where you can have approvals and the ability to have someone else look that over before it's merged into a main branch in the system. Again, part of that version controlling is also our ability to have branching and merging of configurations in a very Git like style without having to actually use Git for that. And then sort of the way that that all interacts with the system, with your existing infrastructure, things like that. So there's a web UI, like most tools like this. You can log in to view it and see some changes. We'll actually get into that later on in the session here. We're going to have a demo where we look at some things in the web UI. And then there's a REST API as well for largely for management of the system itself. So getting artifacts that you've generated of configuration in and out, user management, things like that. So the REST API is largely for the system management. And then for the data that you store inside Infrahub, very robust GraphQL API to allow you to interact with that data in the way you need to do. And not just from read to get it out, but also write via mutations and the ability to insert and modify data in Infrahub via GraphQL. So sort of a lot of things there, but the goal really is that the focus of Infrahub is to serve as a central point for a lot of other things that go off into your infrastructure for automation. And the goal is to not have to deploy 5 or 6 other tools as well. You don't also separately need the CI tool to perform checks on the data. You don't separately need something to render your configuration. You can do all of that in one place. So when we compare what is Infrahub doing in comparison to, some different ways that the organizations can approach this today. So if we started looking at what does a traditional, GitOps with infrastructure as code approach look like, if I were to take all of my device configurations and put them in Git, I would have version control. I would have immutability bound. This is what it is. This is what it was. This is if somebody's proposing a change. But there's no structure to that. There's no schema to how the data is stored. It's just files in Git. In addition, the Git user experience and user interface can be really unfamiliar depending on where folks are coming from in their infrastructure management journey. A lot of traditional network engineers, in the past have not had a lot of exposure to Git. Things are changing as we've gone on in the years, but again, there's not a UI focused on that. It's focused on managing of files and managing of code. And the API functionality can vary wildly depending on what Git provider you have, whether you're in GitHub, GitLab, in the Atlassian ecosystem, what have you. So when you go the other way, the other extreme is, you build it in a database. You say, I'm going to have a SQL database. We're going to put all the facts about my equipment in there. Um, what you do lose then is that ability to have some of the Git style version control and the ability to say, this is what it was then, this is what it is now. There's transaction records and things, but writing the code to keep track of those things and managing actually, historic data from a SQL database is very complicated when you're just trying to have your infrastructure configurations. And so You do put it into database, you do get the schema extensions, you do get that capability to have a very nice UI, and very nice API activity, but again, you sort of there's trade-offs in both of those camps. And again, similarly, if you build something in-house, the so-called Frankenstack of I've got bits of this and bits of that, you again are making some large trade-offs. You can have the UI you want because you're designing and building it, you can have the API you want, but your ability to control and maintain the schema may be limited to how comfortable you are in designing and building that system. Again, you might not have access to those version control, things like that. So the goal we're trying to the sort of the sweet spot we're trying to hit with InfraHub is alleviating the need to choose between a lot of those compromises, because we come from being practitioners who have had to make those choices and had to live with the consequences of making each of those choices over the years. And so InfraHub tries to slide right in the middle there to allow you sort of the best of both worlds. So kind of any questions, anything we want to hit there, anything come up in chat, Pete, for around just general InfraHub things. Otherwise, I'll jump into sort of the 1.0 nuts and bolts there.
Steinsy brought up a question about deployment, which I said we could go ahead and talk about here at the end.
Yeah, perfect. Perfect. Thank you. So when we talk SSO and RBAC, what are we talking about here? So at a basic level, in 1.0 and prior to 1.0, our focus in InfraHub was not on things that are somewhat commodity off the shelf. It was on building a system that was radically different in the way it approached this problem from incumbent systems and building something that was very powerful and capable. And so we set aside things that we knew we could get to later that would be somewhat off the shelf things to come in, such as SSO. So in the 1.0 release, in our GA release, we brought in single sign-on capability via OIDC and OAuth 2. We've tested it now out in the field, several customers using it. We're using it ourselves internally, as we'll see a little bit later on in the demo. And we've tested with a few different providers as listed here, but it's what you would expect from a single sign-on experience. So it's able to create the user accounts, bring in group information, things like that. Again, it's kind of one of those things that is table stakes for an enterprise deployment, but it's really nice to have, sort of across the board. And as in most of our installs going forward, that's what we'll see. And it's sort of a critical component for as we go to approach the RBAC, the role-based access control component, to be able to have those users and groups programmatically driven and not have to have somebody creating each user and assigning groups and things like that. So what does it mean? So really the meat of it is in the RBAC. And so this is a busy slide, and so we're going to spend a little bit of time looking here. But the goal of this is really, as you'll see from our Otto the cop variant down there, he's here to check the ID on these users and see that they can get to the right resources. And so the structure that we built into the tool is intentioned to be very flexible and kind of approaches it from two different angles, which we'll go into on the next slide here in a couple slides. But the idea really is that every user of the system gets assigned to a group, and every group gets assigned to a role. So that group and a role have a relationship, the user and the group have a relationship. And then at the role level, we assign permissions to that role. So we're able to say that this role can do these things, this role cannot do those things. It's a really robust framework in that way because we've actually separated both global permissions of I can administer the system or I could merge a branch into main from object level things of I want my data center ops team to only be able to touch the devices that are in the data center. They shouldn't be able to maybe touch the edge security devices, whatever you imagine a scenario, but the ability to define by object types who can access what, who can read it, who can write it, all of those kind of things. So and we'll go into an example in a second here with this diagram, but the idea really is to allow some granularity. So it's not a one-to-one. Different roles can have more than it's not a role to one permission. It's not there's a lot of flexibility in the framework. We've got a lot of documentation about that on the website, on the docs website. So docs.infrahub. We're able to really drive in to some examples that we'll see here in a second. So if I take our first example, I've got Jane, who is an administrator of the system. They are in the admin group. The admin group has an administrator or super admin role assigned to it. And that super admin role has a global permission to write all things, that they are allowed to do all the things in the system. In another example, we've got John in our DC ops group, put into that in the system. say the DC ops in this instance, they only want them able to read information. So that read information has an object permission for all objects that it's set up for to read instead of write. So I mean, it's kind of straightforward as you look at it, but there's just a lot of parts in there to allow flexibility based on many different scenarios that you might encounter. Um, and like I said, we'll demonstrate some of this here in a few minutes when we get into the UI and show what that kind of looks like for different users with different permissions. So I kind of talked about it a little bit earlier, but what's the difference between global and object permissions? So really what it comes down to for global permissions, it's about the system-wide things. Like I said, editing the default branch, editing permissions, bringing proposed changes into main, anything that would impact the larger system as a whole is a global permission type. And then object permissions are around the specific things in the database in Infrahub. Would be devices, interfaces, IP addresses, whatever it may be. Those object types, you can go in and allow read or write to those for a specific group. You can a role. You can go in and deny the ability to update tags as an example. There's a few different things. But it's very granular. You can even do string-based denials based on, don't allow edit on anything that starts with data center as an example, or vice versa, do allow it. It's very flexible in that way. So as you can see, when we look back at the diagram, you can assign just object permissions, for example, to a role. You could have global or object. It's about achieving the policy goals that you want in the system. Tried to unencumber folks from any specific restrictions in that way. So, in addition to our focus on, from an enterprise customer perspective, focusing in on the SSO and the RBAC they need to align the system with their environment, we've also done a lot of performance improvements going into our GA release and continue to do. So, our mantra as we've gone about this project with Infrahub has been, and all the things we do at OpsMill, then make it work, make it right, make it fast. And so, you look at the way our development cycle has gone, our very early releases, it was about making it work. And then, you go into our beta releases. We had an open beta out of the summer this year. Basically, it was about making it right. Is it doing the things we want it to do? Scrubbing bugs, things like that. And now we're really focused on, those things are always there. There's always iteration. There's always additional things coming in. But now let's make it faster. Let's make it do the things we want it to do as quickly as we can. And so one of the areas where we've been putting a lot of effort into, and we're going to have a little background before we kind of talk about it. So on the back end of Infrahub is a graph database. So primarily we're using Neo4j for that. But the idea is a very capable database structure that's focused around nodes and edges. And we got an example here just kind of to look at. But the idea is that these are two circuits in the system. You can see the circuits and all of the related data going outwards. The database itself is very, very performant and very capable. What we started to see was essentially, this is a closer example kind of to see a little better. There's an infrastructure circuit there, its connections out all around it. That's a lot of information that has to be computed. And if we want to do things with that information, it can actually take some time, even for high performance compute. And so where we focused a lot of our time is the database is great at doing the things it's doing. But what we found was that we were not so great at asking the database to do the things the database needed to do. So if you're working with large data sets and you're working in a graph database, I mean, it's true even of SQL too. You can write bad SQL queries, but it's very important for how you structure and how you ask for the data and how you do things with that data when you get it back. Um, there's a lot of things that it's able to write queries that function perfectly fine, but perhaps are slower than they should be. And so a lot of our focus has been on reworking some of the things that function to be more performant in that way. And so, for example, going into 1.0, we put a lot of work into improving how merge happens between different branches. So when you look at the way Infrahub keeps the data, you have that branch data forever. It's immutably in there. And it's a lot of data with a lot of changes that you're trying to bring together. A lot of computations have to happen and a lot of calls to the database have to happen. And so there's opportunities for improvement there. So we focused on that, on the things that go into the merge itself, as well as just viewing a diff between two branches. Say I've made a change over here. I've got the main branch I potentially want to bring that change back to in our UI. What does that diff look like? Speeding that up has actually been one of our focuses, because as we get to customers that have these larger and larger data sets in there, we're finding these places where, hey, we can just improve how that works. We may have known that was there for a while, but we've put it to side to focus on other things until we've needed to. The other being the proposed change functionality of how you actually view those differences and propose that I want to bring this change from this branch into the other. So one of the examples that I love to see it and of the hard work that our backend teams put into it, just diff generation between pre-release to the 1.0 release, there's a 30% increase in the performance in the time it takes for 30% decrease essentially in the time, but a 30% increase in performance doing a diff on a proposed change, and that's very noticeable on very large proposed change. And that's not the end of that. That's where we continue to want to focus on improving performance there, finding any bugs that may live there, those kind of things as we go forward. But it was really exciting to see in our J release just some tremendous performance improvements over prior releases. And we're going to see some more of that going forward. We've got some ongoing efforts to continue to improve those things as well as others. So as part of our 1.0 release, we also made some large changes to the UI in Infrahub. So sort of the fourth corollary, that's make it right, make it work, make it right, make it fast, is also let's make it better, let's make it pretty now. And so our focus in 1.0 of part of our UI rewrite was not just change the colors or put some new icons in there. We have a dedicated UX designer and a UI team to focus on how people use the tool and what does the experience inside of Infrahub look like. And the result of that is some of the rewrite work that's gone into 1.0. And again, we'll dive in and we'll give some example and we'll see what the new UI looks like in here in a little bit. But again, it was about the whole user experience and how do our users use Infrahub? What are the ways in which we can improve? And focusing on the workflow that they are using as they go about the tool. Nothing's to be in a vacuum of let's make this look different for this reason, or ooh, I want to change this. It's that totality of how users experience Infrahub. And then part of doing an ongoing process of interviewing users and getting feedback. So it's very much an iterative process that's going to continue as we go forward. With 1.0 was just our chance to make some big changes to the UI and really shape up how we get it closer to our vision for how it looked for folks. So, one of the capabilities that rewrite that enabled with us now is the goal of Infrahub under the hood, and one of the ways that you interact with it is you write a custom schema to control the data. You define what kind of data you want in the system. You define what you want it to look like, what data types it can be. In addition, now you can also define how it's displayed in the system. So part of that same process, you were able to say, I want my user experience for my users of Infrahub to have this information available to them. It needs to be named this. It needs to be positioned here or there. You have a lot more flexibility. And so as an example, looking here, these are just two different Infrahub instances, but you can see they have very different uh, objects that are listed in the menu here because this one doesn't have, for example, it has circuit management, but it doesn't have just circuit. But so these are things that are tied to the way that individual people have created their schema and how they want that data represented. Again, the goal is really to strike that middle ground between you don't need to build your own custom Frankenstack where you're maintaining all the code, but you do also want some of that flexibility and that capability to define what the system looks like, to define how, especially part of a larger organization, how people who use Infrahub inside your organization interact with it. And so that's been really good to see kind of the capabilities that are there now after our UI rewrite to do these kinds of things. And like I said, we'll see some examples in a system of what this looks like here in a little bit. So that's all the things that sort of not all the things. There's many, many other things that hit in 1.0, but those are the top big items. One of the things that I like to talk about too in a session like this is what's on the roadmap, what's coming soon. And so some of the things that we're cooking right now is taking that permission framework and making it more granular. So down the line, we want to also be able to, today, you can say all objects of a given type, but be able to get a little more granular and say, based on attributes on that object or metadata, set permissions at that level as well. Like perhaps there's object metadata that you want to be immutable for all but super users. You can control that in the future. So again, it's enhancing the system to provide additional capabilities. One that's coming soon here in our next release is computed attributes. So the idea is essentially a good example is interface naming. I don't want to have to predefine interface names if all of my interface names are always site, device type, and number of the device or what have you. Like if there's a programmatic formula that I can compute for a given attribute on an object in the database, I'd love to be able to just have Infrahub do that for me. And so that's something that we've finished up and is in testing now. That's going to be coming in our next release cycle here. Um, as well coming along. So one of the things that Infrahub does with the CI jobs, and it's able to integrate with Git repositories to bring in your schema, to bring in things like that. There's a lot of things happening on the back end. And so as part of making it work, making it right, we built our own sort of framework in the back end for that originally. And now we're reworking that framework and providing additional visibility and control for what's going on inside Infrahub. Being able to see as a user that there is still a repository sync job or a pending change happening, whatever it needs to be that we can track that's going on behind the scenes, getting some more usability visibility for the system with a brand new framework in there. And so we've already done a lot of that work. That is also going to be coming soon with the capability to have a lot more granular control over the task execution, because it's not just about the data that's in the system, it's about all the things that are due with that data. It's about how to take that data and make it dance. And so that's where this new task framework is really going to shine. So all of that aside, we'll go ahead and I'll stop share for a second to bring back up a demo instance to walk through some things. While I'm doing that, if anybody has any questions, Pete, or anything we want to go through real quick, anything you want to add while I bring this up?
But so far, the questions we've covered. Maybe an important point to clarify here for everyone attending, right? Infrahub is responsible for taking and organizing all of the infrastructure data that you have. And when it comes to deployment, typically what our customers are using Infrahub for is the generation of artifacts, right? So an artifact could be a configuration file, it could be an XML payload, it could be JSON data, could be a documentation or a config file for your monitoring system, whatever that is. But the actual deployment of that artifact, what we found with customers is there's a wide variety of ways that you need to deploy, and they already have systems for that. So that could be anything from Nornir or Ansible. That could be vendor-specific tools like ACI. Apstra was brought up here by Steinsy. That could be Catalyst Center. That could be Fortinet 40 Manager. That could be Terraform, right? That could be, specific API calls to something very specific. And the point of that is that trying to tackle all of the deployment side of this is outside the scope of Infrahub. We've got examples. We've got an integration with Ansible, an Ansible Galaxy collection. We've got Nornir out there already, and various other examples of this. But the deployment side of this is typically handled by existing systems, orchestrators, or vendor-specific workflows.
Absolutely. Perfect call. Thank you, Pete. Appreciate it. So diving in here and taking a look, this is an internal demo instance we have of Infrahub. We'll see right now I'm currently not logged in. So I'm in as an anonymous user. I can view some things, but I have no ability to write anything. So if I come in, just this is a configuration that's been put in place. I can view these objects, but I don't have permission to create it. I can't do a lot of actions here. So as an example, if I go to log in, I'll log in with Google first. So it's same OAuth, OIDC workflow that folks are used to. I happen to already be logged into Google, so it just took me right through. But I now am logged in. You can see that it's me, but I'm logged in with a role that does not have write access on these objects. So I can see that I'm not allowed to do this on a default branch. Now I could create a branch and I could go through that workflow where I make a branch and I make changes, but this version of my user is restricted from making changes to the main branch. This is a very common workflow if we want in a large organization to protect what's in the main branch of configuration in Infrahub. You would have the ability to put roles and put groups in place to force users to go through the branching workflow and not make changes to main. Like say, for example, your automation is driven off of what's in main. Perhaps you want all changes to main to go through a peer review process, so folks that aren't a super admin can't make changes to main. Just as an example, if I log out of that account and log in with my other one, I actually can make these changes to main because this account is a super admin account. So I could come in and I could add a circuit, go through that process here and add it directly to main. Again, this is a workflow choice and one that's very commonly used, but it's not something that is enforced by the system on everyone. It's just part of how people utilize Infrahub in their environments. Similarly, if I take a look at, I kind of showed a little bit earlier, the items that are in the menu here, this is configured by the schema on the back end. And so, in this instance, they're called circuits. There's a separate backbone service level where I could come in and actually configure a service rather than an object. Again, just the raw circuit object, things like that. Those are capabilities that are based out of what we've defined in the schema itself. And so let me get back out here. So again, even while we have OAuth in place, you can also still, I could log in with my local credentials. And so now I'm in as the admin account. All of those capabilities you'd expect are there. And the admin account actually has a lot of the, sorry, to go here, permission. Have the ability, I could come in and I could change my one account. I could say, actually, I don't want them to be Infrahub users. I want that one to have a super administrator privilege, be in that group. Save that. And now if I logged back in as my Google auth, I just happen to know that that's my Google account. It put me in there twice because I'm being silly and coming in with 2 IDPs. But I would have the ability to do super administrator type actions. And again, these groups, these are all flexible to be configured by the end user in the system, by the person administering Infrahub. And so I can come in and I can create an account group. I can associate it with roles. I can create roles themselves. Um, One of the neat things about the way I wanted to show it here rather than in the slides, the way that we configure the permissions, there's a lot of capabilities to have wildcarding and to have it. So for example, the anonymous user in this install, on any object, it can view them. So on all objects, it has view and an allow all. So the idea then of the beyond view, it's not going to be allowed to do anything, it can deny. So the syntax for configuring the permissions themselves at the role level are very much very straightforward. So when we look at what that looks like, you can actually view the breakdown. It's sorted by namespace, names, and then the action and the decision. And so from either way, you can kind of see what roles is this permission applied to, and then from the role level, you can see what permissions a given role has. So that's sort of the high level there of how that looks. Again, you can assign it manually. You can also just have the SSO integration help you with the groups of management, things like that. So let me log back out here real quick and just show, I can't view that because I logged out of the admin and I can't change users and permissions. So if I go back in now with Google, I can view this because I have now the super administrator permissions that were granted in the system here. So that said, that was kind of the larger chunk of things I wanted to go through and show as far as the visible changes. I don't really need to show the old UI. I will just suffice to say that this is much prettier on the eyes than the previous one in terms of usability. And then also that capability to define what is in a device, devices as an example. Let me find one. If we've got an additional, you configure the icon or just the name if no the initial if no icon provided, things like that for the menu customization. So that said, I kind of talked a little fast there. Those were the things I wanted to hit on there. Are there any questions, anything anybody wants to see a little more of? I'd be happy to go through. Anything, Pete or Jordan, you think I should hit on while I'm in here?
What I'd say is go ahead and if with the little bit of extra time here that we've got for anybody that wants to stick around and cover any more, I would say broader Infrahub topics. We've mostly spent our time here on talking about what are the features that have come from our 1.0 GA release, all our enterprise offering that's come out from this. No, there is not going to be a Christmas discount on the the free and open source community edition, Steinsy. Thanks for asking. But yeah, please go ahead and ask away here on the questions, and be happy to, we can expand on that. So we'll give it a moment here. Suresh had brought up a question here about what namespace means in this context. So this is a broader schema question. I'll try and give an abbreviated answer to this. Imagine that you have two companies that need to merge. You could end up actually having to try and create inside Infrahub how you're going to store data for these two companies. And in times where you have overlap that's potentially possible, you need to create some way to identify. Let's take VLANs, for example, right? You could have VLANs from company X and VLANs from company Y in there. And when you create the schema inside Infrahub, you need a way in which you would need to be able to separate out a VLAN 10 in company X versus VLAN 10 in company Y. So you're representing the same objects, the same data, but using namespaces, you would be allowed to essentially do logical separation of those various objects. That's probably the simplest, quickest explanation. It allows a lot of flexibility when trying to have overlapping objects inside Infrahub.
Yeah, and I was like trying to show, but there's not really an example in this particular demo instance of a namespaced object that I was trying to think if there was when I was looking off the side. I don't see one to give a live example in this specific instance, but yes, +1 to what Pete said. I was just looking for a specific example and can't find one here.
I thought the question about using Infrahub for cloud-based infrastructure and the answer that you gave, Pete, might be helpful to share a little more broadly, because that seems like it would be a really common one.
Yeah, great question. So when it comes to cloud, I think one of the first challenges people have when actually trying to do this in anger is each of the different major cloud providers has a very different way of modeling what their infrastructure and objects are. And so the first challenge essentially for any infrastructure person responsible for this is trying to figure out, do you want to try and have a generic model that's going to span across different cloud providers? Or is your business organization all in on one cloud provider, AWS, Azure, DigitalOcean, right? Whoever this is. And so from that, with Infrahub, you can essentially model whatever your need is. And this is some of the power of the flexibility that you can create the schema that you need for your specific business or organization. So you would end up either creating a more generic model where you could end up saying, I have a generic cloud network object, or you could end up doing it in a AWS specific way, right? I have a VNet, for example, and label the objects inside there that way. So first you create the model. And so we've got examples here that you can draw from to end up creating the schema necessary to represent all of that cloud infrastructure objects that you need to keep track of. Then you would store, typically probably pull in that information from your cloud providers and pull that into Infrahub. That brings in another part of this, which is Infrahub Sync, kind of a topic to itself, all in our documentation there, but its job is to do unidirectional or bidirectional sync with other systems out there. So that can solve a wide variety of use cases of how you pull in data from, as I mentioned, cloud providers, but that could be internal systems such as ServiceNow, internal databases, other sources of truth that you may have deployed out there. So do you want to sync the information over from those? So that brings the data into Infrahub, for example. And then using transformations is the part where essentially you're going to take the data out of this and then end up passing that on to some other deployment system. So in the case of cloud, typically what you're doing is you're pulling the data out and then passing it off to most common things that people are using are Terraform. Some people love Pulumi for doing this. There's Crossplane, which is a personal favorite of mine to do this. but that could also just be a Python script that you use to do the API calls directly if you want to. So Infrahub gives you the flexibility to transform that out to whatever system is going to be used to actually push that out to the cloud provider.
And do you have anything else? I was going to answer the next one along there. Stein had asked a question about
Go
the
for it.
API tokens. So the idea is really that those tokens are user specific in this instance. So I could come in and make one, Brett's token. It expires tomorrow, and I'm able to just create it there. So I have a token that has my permissions and not, it's not a system wide thing. So individual users have the ability to have their individual tokens.
Great, thanks. And going to next question here from James about locking. So I think there's probably two concepts in here, right? So one is an organizational workflow, and then how can you use Infrahub on this? One of the beauties of Infrahub here is branches, right? So the most basic thing is create a branch, have everyone work in their own separate branch, right? As opposed to necessarily dealing with locking from that standpoint, is create a branch, enforce that each of the users creates their own branch, and then you don't have a problem at locking time. Then effectively, this is where the CI pipeline of Infrahub comes in, is assuming that all the users are happily working away on nothing that overlaps, then fine. But when it comes to actually trying to then merge that back into main, and you can think of main as similar to a Git style concept of applied to infrastructure. Main in our case typically would be, this is the current intended state of the infrastructure. So have a user create a branch, do their changes, right? Some of those branches may be short-lived, quick changes that you need to do. Update a VLAN, right? Update a port, something like that. But some of those are going to be long-lived changes. You plan for weeks to do some major change in your organization. It requires review, it requires buy-off. And so by the time that you actually get to the point of then approving that change, deploying it out to the infrastructure, and effectively merging that back into main, you may have conflicts. Hence why we've taken those Git-like concepts of branching and bringing that on board. It's not as simple as a lock, because as we all know, there's lots of changes that go on inside the infrastructure. And so you have to resolve those conflicts effectively in a future time when you end up actually merging that back in. So that's an abbreviated version of your answer.
And along the way, just as you were going, kind of went through what a really quick branching and proposed change workflow would look like, just as to illustrate as you were going through there.
Yeah, perfect. Excellent. Thanks. So I'll do a quick answer here next on the audit log side of this. So underneath the hood, if you take a look, maybe Brett, you could just go and click on any object like a device and show the metadata for any object here we've got in the system. So if you take a look, every object inside Infrahub has metadata associated with it. And this also includes all the attributes. So if you go ahead and click on the question mark, the I, not the question mark, like the I symbol, the info symbol there on name, for example. So underneath every single object and attribute inside Infrahub, we have metadata associated with it, describing where did it come from, when was it last updated, who the owner is, right? Going to RBAC related things, and then is protected, for example, on there. And so this allows for a lot of flexibility here. So part of this is audit log capabilities. We have an immutable history of everything in Infrahub. You have the ability to rewind back in time, so you can know who's updated any object or any attribute associated with that object. But this also allows for things such as who's the owner of the data, right? If you have to go and try and update something, and this goes to syncing, for example, is that some of the data coming into Infrahub may be coming from some other system of record, source of truth. And that other system may be authoritative for the data. So it is pushed unidirectionally on a sync job periodically into Infrahub, and you're not allowed to update it inside Infrahub. And you need to figure out, and you go to the other system. What is the other system? And if you don't have right access to the other system, then you can look up who the owner or team is of that other system so that you can go and ask them to make appropriate changes. So it's wider than just audit log. This is also the history of objects and where did the data come from, and ownership and RBAC all tied into one here with metadata. And Suresh's question here on SaaS version coming up. Yes, we're working away on a cloud SaaS based option for people that want to take that path for deployment, right? So we will still certainly have an on-prem version. We'll have a cloud SaaS offering coming next year. So stay tuned, go to the opsmill.com website. You can sign up for a mailing list to get periodic emails from us on updates of everything that's coming along. If that's something you're incredibly interested in, I'd suggest you go ahead and reach out to us, and I can get you included into any beta testing that we're going to be doing on that. But yes, certainly for those that want to consume it that way, that'll be an option in the future. And then going next to Reyes's question here, when using Infrahub Sync, you mentioned pull update from other databases or sources of truth. Are those changes automatically synced with the main branch, or is a new branch created? Excellent question. This is the deployment choice, effectively. And making this slightly more broad, it depends on what that other system is. So if you actually talk about some of the systems out there for doing post-change validation, for example, right? So if you take something like a NetPicker, a IP Fabric, a Forward Networks, Suzy Q, right? Systems that go out and actually gather state data from the network. One of the workflows that people want to be able to do is to take in, you have your intended state that's inside Infrahub. You have your actual state that you're gathering out there from the network, and you need to be able to reconcile those, right? Because we all know that people will go and make midnight unauthorized changes and then forget to actually go and put that back inside of Infrahub. And at some point, you've got to find out where all those things happened and clean that up. And so a great workflow for that, for example, is to bring in that actual state data into a branch in Infrahub, and then effectively do a diff, compare all of the actual state data with the intended state and see all the differences. So you can go around and figure out from a human standpoint who you need to point the finger at and tell them to follow the actual business process that you're trying to put into place. But if you have things that are more trustworthy, that are authoritative, and you want to push those straight to main, then go for it. Make sure that you got the right data validation and everything in place that you really, truly trust that's going to come in and doesn't need human review, then that's capable as well. And then let's see. Philip's question here is, for Git-like branching operations, what sort of merge conflict resolution methods are offered or recommended? This is a good question, because I'm not sure I can articulate the best answer around on this. I think the first major concept around this, though, is that this is not Git, right? We are trying to model infrastructure data, and that is based upon underneath Infrahub is a graph database that we've abstracted away with our schema language. And then we are taking Git-like concepts and reapplying them on top of a graph database. You want to have the graph database to be able to understand the relations between the objects, right? That's one of the things that you lose by going down the path of using Git, right? Right? The database is going to be able to tell you that you have a device which is related to interfaces, which is related to IP addresses. So you want that relational model underneath it. But those databases didn't support Git-like concepts there. So when it actually comes to doing something like a merge operation, rebases, we do have a few equivalent type concepts to be able to do things like a rebase and a merge, for example. But I would say some of the complexity that you see really in Git is trying to handle things that are kind of outside the scope of infrastructure. So in that way, I would say it's a more simplified Git-like approach that we're taking on top of this. But we've got some of the basics in there today.
Yeah, tried to show us we were going along some of the basics. There is a capability to rebase if changes have been made to main since you created this proposed change. So if there have been additional changes there, and since I wanted to add this device, I could rebase off of that and rerun my diff calculations and my checks and all of those good things about what is going on. So, for example, what the pipeline looks like. There's a check in here for there a data conflict, things like that. But yes, so there's absolutely those base concepts there. And I think some of the more complex things may come over time, but as it's not focused on code in the same way, it won't always be the goal is not a one-to-one mapping to get functionality by any means.
And going to this question here of that Steinsy brought up here around core models. So this is a great question, right? Infrahub by itself does not come with a opinionated schema. And this is a major difference, but this is also, frankly, the reason why people are choosing Infrahub in the first place, is that every one of our deployments so far, people start off with some type of starting point and then start customizing this to actually meet their business needs and workflow needs. And that's the reason why people come to us. So we have a schema library out there published. And in that schema library, we're covering a lot of the fundamental infrastructure concepts and technologies that people are using. That's a growing library. That's something we're also asking from community contributions to end up coming in. Is if you've got examples of infrastructure that you've modeled that we've not got in there, then we'd love to be able to add those on in. But I think the main point of this is there will never be a one reference opinionated schema that people are going to use in Infrahub, because that's the exact reason why people want Infrahub, is to have that customization, that flexibility, and also to get towards higher level concepts such as service catalog definition inside of it and mapping those more complex workflows and infrastructure that they can't do in current, tools that are out there today.
These are great questions.
Yeah,
Did
this
answer
is
one.
fantastic.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Nope, this is fantastic. I'm noticing time here. We're coming up to just about the top of the hour. Brett, if you wanted to cover that last one. Otherwise, let's go ahead and wrap up. You're muted. You're still muted, Brett. I'll go ahead and say it for you.
Sorry. Yep. That is always fun with the mute button. But yeah, so we have a demo instance up at demo.infrahub.app, for everybody to go check it out themselves. It's definitely something that I recommend getting your hands on.